Good morning. Well, that Thanksgiving season did not go as we intended, did it? I have just finished the grading the majority of my students' COVID-19 projects, and I wanted to walk through some of it with y'all because it's a little different than what you're seeing, and some of it could be interesting. Um, Clearly, we did not get the results from the COVID-19 expectations from Thanksgiving, and across the country things are worse. And so we're not going to do, usually I just look at Texas because that's what affects us, but I want to show you what some of my students have done, and I want to do it in real time. So first and foremost, we get this data from the COVID tracking project. It is hosted by a newspaper, or a magazine, which is a bit of a concern. But then the data tends to track with the other data systems. So if you want data and you want something to play with, this is a really good data set. It has data by state, totals for the US. It's a great place to look for stuff, and they do daily updates, right? So if you want just your state, you can pull it down and so on. You got to be a little careful here because you've got to understand how data works in order to look at it. But I've done some of that consolidation for us already. So this data set is called a cross-sectional data set as opposed to a time series data set. The stuff that we have normally done to date is time series. It looks at what is happening across time, March versus April, April versus May on a day-to-day basis. This is state by state. It is a cross-section of what's happening across the state. And these death totals are the total number of people who have died in this particular state. This death rate is the total number of deaths divided by the total population and gives us a death, some calculation thereof. And there's some really interesting things here right at the beginning, like how come nobody's reporting the death rate on the news? Well, if we were to report in this case, for example, in California, a 0.05%, right? A 0.0005 death rate, then it wouldn't really make a lot of news. But, the potential for these. And so nobody's arguing that these are relatively small numbers compared to the population, but they are, considered relatively big numbers compared to what we should expect over the total number of deaths. So when you argue with your buddies, this is one of those. But more importantly, you don't want to look at this spreadsheet. You want to look at the fancy worksheets, which we have not built yet, right? I'm going to do these in real time so that you guys can see what this stuff looks like. And so let me, I don't want the state there. Let's begin with total number of deaths, which is terrible. Again, flipping it over to attributes or dimensions, right? And so if we were to look at the biggest number of deaths, and this is, stats 101, the first thing we notice is where are the biggest deaths? New York, Texas, California, Florida. How come? Well, these are the states with the biggest populations, right? So looking at total number of deaths is not an appropriate measurement for what's going on here. So we're going to have to take this guy out, and we're going to look at the rates of death within the states. And then we end up with New Jersey, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Louisiana, New York, Rhode Island, North Dakota. And there's something very particular about this group here, and that is that the majority of these states are in the Northeast. And so my students had a lot of trouble with this because it's not the expectation, and you'll see what I mean in a minute. There's a couple of other states where you would imagine would have worse results than, the Northeast. And so there's an argument here that there's a geographic reflection that could be a couple of different things. And we'll explore a couple of those in just a second. This is not going to be a short video. The first one is that this is the area that got hit first, right? If you think back to February and March, it's New York City. And if you know New York City, or if you've ever lived on the Northeast coast, you know that people who work in New York City don't all live in New York City, right? They train from as far away as, Vermont and New Hampshire and New Hampshire and all this other stuff that's just crazy. And they come in from New Jersey, and they come in from upstate New York, and they some people come in from all over the place. And so probably not New Hampshire. That's a bit of a stretch. But you know, they come up from up north, and so it's a bigger place for potential spread because it was earlier in the year, and we are better now at being able to manage that response. In addition, you've got the concentration issue, right? People that are in the subway in a that are recirculating air in a place where it doesn't circulate. So population density and viral load are a concern here. So this is where I would start this research project, and I would say to myself, how come these states are over here, and how does that work out, right? And if I were to continue, matter of fact, before we do that, let's make it all nice and pretty here. Let's look at just the United States, and I'll show you what I mean when we keep on. There you go. So here's our death rates, and let me throw out death rates for a second and bring total deaths back in to make my point. If we look at total deaths, then we worry about New York, Texas, California, etc. But if we worry about the total number of death rates, oh man, I ruined this, by state. There you go. By state. Well, you get the point. The total number of states, then they're different, right? Then we have the concentration up here in the Northeast, and now North Dakota, South Dakota, which was not the case a month ago. That is very interesting. My students were forced to do data up to a particular date so that they were all in the same place. And North Dakota, South Dakota did not have this darker blue. So that's interesting. Louisiana, Mississippi has darkened in blue, and that fits more with our results. That is not good. That is not good at all. A population that doesn't have great population density has higher rates than other states. That's not great. All right, let's move on. And now what I'd like to do is look at death rates, attributes, and look at things like diabetes. And remember that what we have here is the, what we're showing here is the rate of diabetes in a state. These are backwards. I want death rates on the left-hand side, right? So if I were to go to, you know, I don't know what state this is. Let's grab a state and label them all. If I were to go to Texas, which is where we are, and annotate, mark the label, you know, always show the label, then I would have, you know, a death rate of 0.0007, but 12% of the population has diabetes in the state of Texas. And then we kind of look at the data and we say, hey, well, what does this kind of look like? Well, there is a correlation here. Stuff is kind of all over the place, but we're looking at a correlation between death rates and diabetes, and we're saying, well, people with diabetes are more susceptible. Well, maybe if we look at that on a state-by-state basis, let's do a trend line and see if that's the case. Yes, those areas or those states that have higher degree of diabetes do appear to have greater deaths, but the line is relatively flat, and so it's only a partial descriptor, right? And we can do all sorts of these. This is the great thing about this program. You want to talk about, everybody wants to talk about obesity, so let's talk about obesity. Calm down, hold on, let me change it. Death rate and obesity, very, very similar. Obesity clearly plays a factor. You can see the steepness of the line of diabetes is a higher line than the obesity line. And so there's a lot of comments about getting in shape right now. They're absolutely true. But if you're diabetic, whether or not you're obese, you know, that's something to pay attention to. So these things are real and they are happening, and we see that in a cross-sectional regional deal. Let's look at something else. Let's look at, there's a great argument about the Genie Index. For those of you who don't know the Genie Index is an economic measure of economic or financial or economic equality, right? So the higher you are on the Genie Index, the more to the right you are over here in New York, you know, the less income equality there is. The more you are to the left, the greater income equality there is in a particular state. And the United States has a measure, and most states are right here in the middle. New York has the downtown New York problem, right? Utah and Alaska, I don't know, agriculture and oil. I think these are two different stories here, but very fascinating. New Jersey has a relatively high Genie Index, but they're way up here in terms of deaths. And so you do see across states a place where, you know, greater income inequality does result in a lot more deaths or a higher death rate. And this line looks fairly steep, right? And so that leads us to think about stuff like, where are the poor people? Poor people in these particular states on the right-hand side, up here in this top quadrant, are bigger cities, probably condensed into smaller suburbs, right? New York. I don't know what the issue is in Connecticut. New Jersey is fairly obvious. Massachusetts, you've got Boston. And so you've got levels of poverty. And then you have your southern states that are going to be probably in this bottom right-hand quadrant, right? Higher inequality, but lower death rates. So your Alabamas and Tennessees, North Carolinas, all of these guys. Interesting stuff. Nobody's up here on the top left, right? There is no states with high death rates that have low income inequality, right? That's the big message here. Fascinating. And so then you ask, you know, the sociologists, and the anthropologists then ask the question, well, where are the pockets of poverty and how do they live and how do we do that? And that's a little bit outside of my work, but I would like to see what population density might look like. Population density. This is an argument that I've been having for the past 9 months about population density. And so places like New York, New Jersey, Rhode Island, where there's a lot of people in once Boston, right? Massachusetts again is up here, where you have higher concentrations of population density. There's more, you know, more propensity for the spread of the virus because you're just closer to people. What's ironic is that this pocket of population density is really, again, very, very concentrated. And then you have these guys up here. Who's that? North Dakota, South Dakota. What is happening in North Dakota, South Dakota? I don't know what's happening in North Dakota, South Dakota. That is brand new to me, but it is not good. Those death rates are up high and the population density is way off left. Whatever's happening up here is not positive. And then you've got your southern states, your Louisianas and your Mississippi. Have we talked about obesity already? We have. Let me go back to obesity. I want to talk about the South for just a second. Obesity and dimension. Yeah, again, not huge. Obesity and dimension. What you find over here on the right-hand side are a lot of southern states, right? Now, again, here's a clump of here's a clump of New England states, right? And if you were to turn around and say, well, let's say that New England and these other states got hit in the middle of the year as opposed to the other side of the year, then the obesity line or the obesity regression actually is negative for those states, right? Which is absolutely fascinating. However, if we include everybody else except them, see if I don't know that I can do this with a square graph. But if we exclude those states, then we have a much, much steeper obesity line. And I think this is a better reflection of what's actually going on in the country without the outliers of New Jersey and Massachusetts. More to the point, you've got a lot of southern states over in the right-hand side. Kentucky, Alabama, Mississippi, West Virginia, Arkansas, Oklahoma, Texas, Tennessee. And here you have probably a cultural reflection of, you know, the barbecue states is probably what we should call them. South Carolina, where's Illinois? Illinois is not really a barbecue state. You can fight me on that one later. Yeah, let's call these the barbecue states. And they're going to have higher degrees of death rates that appear to be associated with themes like obesity. All right, so that's interesting. Finally, the last one we want to look at is smoking. Smoking dimensions. Smoking is bad. In the terms of COVID-19, I know we're talking a lot about obesity, probably because smoking already has a bad name, but I don't know that we're really talking that much about smoking. If you are smoking, there's no better time to stop. I mean, the death rates along with smoking rates, you know, and you look at the percentages. Let's look at the percentage of smokers in Texas. Texas is not bad. 14% of the population is a smoker. And I don't know how they measure this, you know, one a week, one a day. I don't know what the measurement is. But whatever the national measurement is for rating the population of smoking, Texas is actually pretty low, which is a little surprising to me. But, you know, again, the southern states, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, Arkansas, Kentucky, West Virginia has a smoking rate of 25%. And I'm sure that was like 3 times as much 20 years ago. So I think the country's doing better on that stuff in general, but it's very clear that those states that have higher degrees of smoke, higher rates of smoking, are also having higher, oh no, this is obesity, smoking and obesity. I'm doing the wrong graph here, people, my apologies. This one goes here, obesity gets thrown out. Death rates. Yeah, I'll probably cut that out altogether. I'll cut that. You know, data's messy, right? I'll cut that out altogether. Smoking is the exact opposite of what we would expect. But let's take this New Jersey, Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York, and let's throw some of these out. Let me see what's the best way to do this. Whoops. Let's throw some of these out. How do I do this? Sum, I don't want sum, I want dimensions. Still fairly flat, so not much of the smoking, which is ironic because you know that the rates of smoking have decreased over time, right? Higher smoking is the southern states over here. Again, data's messy. Yeah, so smoking's not the biggest concern, but it's still there. I think you have a problem where you should be excluding these 4 guys. There you go. If you exclude those 4 outliers, now you've got that positive sloped line that you would expect to see, right? And again, we have these are the early in the year states, right? These are the guys that got hit in March and April. These are the guys that got hit in March and April, and so their death rates are different than the rest of the country, because if we throw them out, then the smoking line comes back into play. All right, I feel a lot better. Maybe I'll leave in the display from earlier, right? And this is a data management issue. You've got to know which ones to throw out and why. But if you do, you get, you get a better, closer description. Again, to my students who are watching this, or everybody, nobody's perfect. You can see how easy it is to massage the data, so it's important to understand what the data looks like, because if we include them, our regression line actually shows negative, right? And that doesn't make sense. Why would smoking, why would smoking increase? Because that's what this is saying. Smoking actually increases your survivability, and that's not true. You have a particular something is happening in the New England states that is throwing off the entirety of the data. And if we were to exclude them, then you have the upward slope where the increase in death rate increases with the increase in smoking. So fascinating stuff. I hope this has been helpful. Is there anything else we can look at? There's a bunch of other stuff. Oh, yes. Okay. So let's look at something like death rate, and let's go back to obesity, because that's the one everybody wants to know about. Obesity. Oh, yes. So, we have, so we're going to get political for just a second. One of the things that we did with our data sets is that we went out and grabbed the governor's data, age, name, party, or whatever. And one of the things we can do by grabbing the governor's party per state is to drop them into our graphs. So we're going to get fancy for just a second. And now we've got Democrats and Republicans in terms of death rates and the other. So let me turn around and change the color so that we see them. And then I'm going to make it just a little bit bigger to accentuate the point. Now, I'm not trying to make a political statement here. I'm just showing you what the data looks like, right? And I would not suggest to you that certain governors, Republican or Democrat, are less concerned than other governors, Republican or Democrat. And so it's very easy to turn to this graph and say that Republican governors are doing worse than Democratic governors because their steepness line in terms of obesity is higher, right? We could turn around and do two of these. The Genie Index, for example. And let me switch that back to dimension, right? So in this case, if you talk about income inequality, then Democrats are doing worse than Republicans are, right? And that's not necessarily telling. And so let's focus on one problem at a time. So don't use this stuff to go over and beat up your friends. You're not necessarily having the right conclusion here. I would suggest to you that what you're seeing in this graph in terms of obesity and death rates, if you split the two, is that states who elect Republican governors are more likely to have different social characteristics, right? Such as the barbecue states, right? Mississippi, Louisiana's Democrat, Arkansas, Alabama, Oklahoma, Kentucky. Where's Texas? Texas is in here somewhere. Tennessee, Texas, Missouri. All of these are your barbecue states, right? Most of them are Republican. And so there is a behavior associated, there's a social behavior that could be associated with a particular political party. And that political party is more apt to elect a governor that aligns with their political party. And that is a reflection not of the decisions made by the governor in that state in this time period, but probably of the cultural and social behaviors in that state. And we see that when we walk through the smoking and the diabetes and the obesity numbers. So somebody's going to ask me about gender. So I'm going to throw out government party, and this is interesting to me. Governor's gender, and governor's gender. So they're about the same, but it looks like, I'm very surprised. I would think that the female governors would do better than the male governors. I bet you that changes when we change the bottom line. Yeah, interesting. Let's throw all of that out again. All right, well, I hope that was, let me do the other one, that the obesity in 1990. Oh, I'm missing a bunch of observations. All right, I'll throw that out. Well, I hope that's been helpful. It's interesting to say the least. I'm very proud of my students and what they've been able to do this semester. And I wanted to show you some data that was different than, let's finish with the map. And I wanted to show you some data that was different than what you've been seeing. Keep only. Different than what you've been seeing. If we look at the map and we just play with the map for just a second, let's do labels and death rates, right? North Dakota, South Dakota are a huge surprise to me. Louisiana, Mississippi, not so surprising when you look at they're high on diabetes, they're high on obesity, they're high on smoking. So you have some social behaviors that makes Louisiana and Mississippi higher places for death rates. One Democrat, one Republican. The concentration in higher death rates continues to be in the North England coast. and I would attribute that to population density. And so I think, we've been talking about, the big five, right? Smoking, heart issues, obesity, I don't remember, whatever the big 4 or 5 are, but I think the one that we've been missing is population density. And I would argue that there is some population density issues happening here, although this is concerning and walks against my little hypothesis. So, I hope that's been helpful. I certainly enjoy playing with the data. I hate what it's telling me, and whatever it means for you and your Christmas decisions, stay safe out there.